introduce our three speakers who, very briefly, who will speak in more or less the order they're sitting there. Peter Stephen is the author of About Canada Media, a book in the About Canada series on the media, published by Fernwood this year. And he is a professor of film studies at Sheridan College in Oakville, Ontario. This is all described, of course, in your program, but I want to add that this book is available upstairs at the Rabble table. Is that correct? Yes. Yeah. Thanks. So you can obtain it there. Secondly, to decide who is second, is it SUT? SUT JHALLY will go second. Dr. SUT JHALLY, Professor of Communication at the University of Massachusetts. He was one of our first graduates from our School of Communication doctoral program, and he left at about the same time that I arrived in the 1980s. And he's one of our most distinguished graduates. I still have the SUT JHALLY Memorial file cabinet that I purchased from him in 1984, sitting in my home office. But SUT is also, in addition to being an academic, he's taken his work very much into the community through founding the Media Education Foundation, which has created a number of brilliant critical videos and materials of media analysis and media education. Many of his films I've used repeatedly in my own classes. So SUT JHALLY will be speaking second. And thirdly is JUDY REBICK, who you may have heard from if you were here earlier today. The founding publisher of rabble.ca, Canada's most popular independent online news, for which he still writes, author of a number of books, and an advocate of social justice and women's rights and equality for many, many years. So it will be wonderful to hear from all three of them on the topic of where does media democracy, the movement, go next? What are the priorities and opportunities at this point in time? So I'm going to ask them, since we are pressed for time, we'll take 10 minutes each, and then open it up to questions via your written comments. So please get your piece of your file card to write your comments, questions down. So without further ado, let's start with Peter Stephen.
Thanks, Bob. I wondered why you didn't mention Don Cherry in your CBC. The person I believe who does pull down the highest salary at CBC, something in the neighborhood of $700,000 a year. It's really great to be here. Great to be in Vancouver and to be able to attend this event. It's nice to see so many people are here, and certainly to sit at the table with these two illustrious folks to my left as well. I would like to convince you of something, and that is that in Canada today, we are living under the shadow of three myths about the Canadian media. Three myths about the Canadian media. These myths, I think, come from a range of sources. They certainly come from public relations firms, such as the companies that Sut talked about last night. They come from so-called think tanks, like the Fraser Institute, the C.D. Howe Institute. They come from, of course, the Conservative Party and its various adjuncts, I guess. They also come, of course, from the dominant media companies operating in Canada today, telecommunications, and broadcasting, etc. But also, I think that these myths are perpetrated by, to some extent, delusions among those of us who are liberals and on the left. I'll say a few words in a minute about what I mean by that. And these myths are important to recognize because they obscure what I think should be quite clear, and that is that Canadian media in general has entered a period of real decline. So what are these three myths? Firstly, the news business is broken. The news business has entered a period of crisis. It has collapsed. Their business model no longer works. The business model that's based on advertising primarily no longer works. I'm sure that all of you have heard this many times, particularly in the dominant media. Collapse of Advertising revenue is one factor that's been given over and over again. This started before the Great Recession in 2008, but it certainly has picked up steam since then. There is a belief that advertising revenue has completely dried up and has made profits impossible among the dominant media, particularly for newspapers. I would respond by saying that that's nonsense. That even in the United States, where perhaps this crisis had some meaning, in the end, very few newspapers disappeared. It's true that a number of newspapers went into bankruptcy, and some of those were quite well known. For example, the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, etc. But those papers have continued to operate and make profits within their own news business since being under the umbrella of bankruptcy. So there's no proof whatsoever that in the United States or in Canada, the news business itself is a money-losing proposition now. Profits used to be in the 30% range in some areas of the news business, certainly for radio and often for newspapers as well. Since the Great Recession a couple of years ago, some profits have dropped in some sectors to as low as 10%. Even in the worst of times, 2009 in the United States, on average, newspapers were making profits of 10% per year. Those are the kinds of profits that other sectors of the economy would die for. Manufacturing, retail, any other sector you can think of. Even aerospace these days. 10% profit. The truth is that the state, Canadian state and others, need newspapers to disseminate information and to disseminate their various ideologies. And the truth is also that the elites need newspapers to communicate with each other and to also pressure the government, lobby the government, etc. And so newspapers within the dominant media are not going anywhere. Their profits are quite healthy. Just this week, the Toronto Star, which is under the umbrella of Tor Star, announced record profits for the past year, including in the newspaper business, not just in their subsidiary businesses. Myth number 2, and I think this is in some ways the most insidious one, and perhaps the one that applies most to us in the room, and I certainly include myself. The myth is, we're all online now. And you hear this over and over again. Well, we're all online now. It doesn't matter if the newspapers are having trouble and are disappearing. We've got all this new social media. Everybody has access to it. Even my grandmother has a, not my grandmother, but even my grandmother has a, a Skype account or follows bloggers, etc. I would respond to that. Also, that is nonsense. Any studies that have come out, genuine studies that have come out that have been objective and not prepared by telecommunications businesses in Canada, show that anywhere from 40 to sometimes more than 50% of Canadians do not have broadband access, are not able to use broadband in their daily life. The media industry is quick to say that Canada is very advanced. It has very high levels of broadband penetration. They even will say that 94% of Canadians have access to broadband. Well, access doesn't mean that you can afford it or that it's available on a regular basis where you live. It's very difficult to get regular, good, moderately priced broadband in many, many areas of Canada. And I'm not just talking about the far north, I'm talking about suburbs. And the truth is, a truth that's been stated now by 3 international studies, a study that came out of Harvard in 2009, a study that was done for Oxford University School of Business, also in 2009, and then just recently by the United Nations OECD, ranks Canada quite low in comparison to many other countries in their study. A study of about 33 countries showed that the price for broadband in Canada was about 28th out of 33 countries. So it was more expensive to have broadband access in Canada than it was in most of the other countries in the study. It also showed that universal access was something that was slipping in Canada as a goal and as a reality. It's true that there's more information and analysis out there than ever before, online. It's true that for business elites, for academics and students, and for many other Canadians, there is, because of new media, there is more information available. And certainly more analysis and information available to those of us on the left than there has ever been before. That's absolutely true. But for many, many Canadians, perhaps 50% of Canadians, that is not the reality. We are not all online now. And myth number 3, which is certainly connected to the first two. The old media are dead. Film, TV, radio, they're so 20th century, they're so old hat, they're so passé. You hear this quite a bit. Who cares? We're all online, and so the old media is dying, and maybe that's a good thing. Nevertheless, 90% of Canadians, probably more, but at least 90% of Canadians, get their news, their regular news, through television. Television is not going anywhere. It's not going anywhere as the dominant source for news in Canada. And even if we say that we don't watch a lot of television, or we watch it selectively, or we can watch it critically, I would challenge everyone in this room to say that you are not, I am not affected by what is going on in TV. We are all affected by it. Whether we know it or not, and whether we like it or not, we are affected. We're affected by the huge amounts of violence within entertainment media, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. We're also affected by the flip side of that, which is, colloquially, the lack of violence in the reporting of war news. Okay? So, just moving on. These 3 myths, I would say, contribute to and mask and camouflage the reality that Canadian media is in decline. Just 4 quick examples. The quantity and quality of news that's available to Canadians is now less than it used to be. If you look at television news in particular, including the CBC, there is less time devoted to news stories in the national broadcasts than there were a few years ago. The number of news stories, the length of news stories, the depth of news stories is not as good now in newspapers as it used to be as well. Secondly, the quantity of Canadian drama is much less than it was 10 years ago. There's been a very steep decline since the 1990s in the production of new Canadian drama programs that would be shown on prime time. There's even been a decline in Canada's probably most successful sector, and that is within children's television. In children's television, there are now fewer programs being funded. Those programs that are funded have to be done cheaper. And very often, those programs and the adult primetime dramas are shown on the subsidiary networks. They're not necessarily shown on primetime in the regular networks. So although the media companies say there's probably some hope that things might improve in the next year or two, that they are going to be producing more programs, there's no guarantee that they will be shown on the main channels. So it's harder to see this material. Third, in terms of access to information, one of the previous access to information bureaucrats in Ottawa mentioned in one of her last reports that the situation in Canada with regard to access of information for the federal government is a disaster, particularly in terms of getting information about the war in Afghanistan and climate change. Senior journalists that I've talked to at the CBC and other researchers in Ottawa say that it is more and more difficult to get any information whatsoever, financial, etc., from the military, Department of Defense in Ottawa. With climate change, the question is access to government scientists who have something to say. It's getting more and more difficult to find people who are allowed to talk to the media. So this is a big problem. So let me just conclude with one idea, I guess, one idea in the form of a modest proposal, perhaps a modest demand, about quality in Canadian drama. And I don't think this has come up at all today, and so even though I'm last or next to last, I'm glad I have something to say. Is it true that the only people with complex lives, the only people with hopes and frustrations, the only people with skills and dreams, with comedy, heroism, and drama in their lives that show up on Canadian TV? Is it true that the only people who have those things are the police? So my modest idea, my modest demand would be, let us resolve to say no more cop shows. A moratorium on cop shows.